So now I want to spend some time talking about the cell membrane specifically. So we've been talking about phospholipid bilayers in general. I want to specifically talk about the cell membrane. So the cell membrane, also known as the plasma membrane, is a phospholipid bilayer barrier between a cell and its environment. And this cell membrane has many functions. It is used for transport of materials into and out of the cell. It is a barrier. It does keep the outside stuff out, keeps the inside stuff in, but sometimes we need to move things into the cell and move things out of the cell, so we have to get them across the cell membrane. So the cell membrane is used for transport into and out of the cell. The cell membrane is also important for something called a transmembrane potential, which sounds big and fancy, kind of is, but it's really important for how neurons work and muscle cells work, and I'll kind of introduce that concept a little bit later. And another reason why cell membranes are important is because they function in cell-to-cell communication. So this is a picture of a cell membrane. You can see we have our basic phospholipid bilayer, but it's definitely more than just a phospholipid bilayer. The purple things in the pictures are proteins. The blue things, that's actually cholesterol. And the green stuff, those are carbohydrates. So if you notice, the carbohydrates are mostly just found on the extracellular face of the cell membrane, and they're very important in that cell communication thing I mentioned. Lots of proteins in the cell membrane. A lot of them are there for transport, but they have a lot of other purposes too. The cholesterol is kind of an interesting component. The cholesterol helps to maintain the fluid state of the cell membrane. By adding more cholesterol or taking away cholesterol, the membrane becomes more or less fluid. This is a phospholipid bilayer, so it's essentially like a semi-fluid, if you will. And so if we need to make it more solid or more liquid, we can change the amount of cholesterol that's present in order to change that fluidity, if you will. So in terms of structure, most of the cell membrane is made of, hopefully you said phospholipids. Yep, it's mostly made of a phospholipid bilayer. But the cell membrane also contains something to keep the membrane fluid but not too fluid. Hopefully you guessed cholesterol. The cell membrane also contains something on the external surface. It's mostly there for cell identification purposes. Hopefully you guessed carbohydrates. And the cell membrane also contains proteins, which have lots of different functions. So this picture, or these 6 pictures, actually show you some of the functions of the proteins in a cell membrane. Right? And all of the pictures, the blue side is extracellular, and this sort of sandy colored side is intracellular. Right? So the blue is the protein, the gold is the phospholipid bilayer. So here we can see a protein that's allowing circles to come into the cell. So this is a protein that's acting as a transporter. Here we see a protein that is taking in diamonds and turning them into circles, which sounds like magic. But this picture is supposed to represent an enzyme. So it's another function of proteins in the cell membrane. Here we see a protein in the cell membrane that's binding to something else, and then apparently some radio signals go off inside the cell. This is representing communication. So this is some sort of signaling molecule that when it binds to this protein, a signal is sent inside the cell. So we would call this protein, by the way, this is a receptor. It's receiving a signal. Here you have a protein with carbohydrates attached, and this is for cell identification purposes. A good example of this is, you've probably heard of the A, B, and O blood groupings. What determines your blood type is actually the presence or absence of certain carbohydrates attached to your cell membrane. Here we see 2 cell membranes being held together through protein adhesion. So these 2 proteins are sticking together to hold these cells together. And this is very common because many of your cells in your body, you want them to stay where they're at. And some of them you want to move, like your blood cells, but some of your cells you want them to stay where they're at. You can stick them together using proteins in the cell membrane. And here we see a protein in the cell membrane that's attached to something that looks like licorice inside the cell. This is actually the cytoskeleton. Right? So proteins in the cell membrane are often attached to the cytoskeleton. This is really important in things like your muscles.